Good morning. My name is Brittany K. Barnett, and I am the author of A Knock at Midnight, a story of hope, justice, and freedom. A defining moment in my life can be attributed to a 7 digit number 1374671. This number was assigned to my mother by the Texas Department of Corrections when she began serving an 8 year prison sentence. But the significance of these 7 digits is much more than a prisoner number assigned to my mother. This 7 digit number was the gateway to me realizing I had this heightened sense of compassion and empathy that I never knew that I had. This 7 digit number brought me proximate to this issue of mass incarceration and how this issue devastates families and entire communities. On any given day in this country, there are over 2 million children with an incarcerated parent. As I mentioned, mass incarceration devastates families and entire communities. It is heartbreaking to have any loved one in prison, but I can attest that it is a primal wound when it is your mama. I grew up in rural East Texas, a small town with about 1,200 people. And in this town, I had a happy childhood. I wanted to be a lawyer, like Claire Huxtable on The Cosby Show. And I played sports and truly had my own piece of joy in this doors wide open, windows unlocked piece of rural East Texas. But my mother was suffering a debilitating drug addiction. And this is heartbreaking and challenging for any child, especially when you see a parent unfolding your tiny arm's reach away. I realize now that addiction is a disease, and I realize that no matter how much my 10-year-old or 12-year-old self wanted to save my mama, that I couldn't. I also realize now that it was not my burden to bear. Throughout it all, though, my sister and I knew one thing. We knew that we were loved by our mama, and we knew that we were loved unconditionally. Unfortunately, my mother's drug addiction ultimately led to her incarceration. My mother needed treatment, not prison. And after serving 2.5 years in prison, I am happy to say that my mother became sober. My mother became sober in spite of prison, not because of it. She found something deep within herself and found a peace deep within herself that allowed her to go on her journey of sobriety. But this issue of having a mother incarcerated was something that I was holding near and dear to my heart. After my mother went to prison, I graduated from the University of Texas at Arlington. By this time, I had a master's degree in accounting. I was getting ready to sit for the CPA, Certified Public Accountant exam, and I was going off to work for PricewaterhouseCoopers, one of the largest four accounting firms in the world. But once a month, on a Friday, my sister and I were traveling nearly 3 hours for our Saturday 2 hour visit with our mama. These visits were challenging. It shows how when one person goes to prison, the entire family goes to prison. And during this time, this dream of becoming a lawyer that I'd always had started to reappear at the fringes. For some reason, growing up in rural East Texas, becoming a lawyer, becoming Claire Huxtable started to seem like it was a dream that was out of my league. There were no lawyers who looked like me in my community. There were hardly any lawyers at all. But this dream started coming back, and I decided, with the encouragement of my mom, to really be up for that challenge, to know that I could be anything that I wanted to be. I did a random search one day at on the website of a law firm called Baker Botts. And on the law firm's websites, you can scroll through the photos and read bios of the lawyers. And the first Black woman lawyer I saw was Krista Brown Sanford. And I sent her this random email. I told her we worked in the same building, that I was an accountant, but I'd always wanted to be a lawyer. And I asked her if she would meet with me at the Starbucks downstairs for guidance on the law school process. Krista responded. She responded to me, a total stranger, and she agreed to meet me. I will never forget that day, the day that my Claire Huxtable in the flesh walked into the Starbucks. And Krista took my hand that day, and she has never let it go. And it really was a life lesson for me on the importance of paving the way for others. While in law school, I knew that I was going to practice corporate law. It was a natural gravitation for me, being an accountant. But I took a critical race theory course. And in this course, it analyzed the intersection between the race and the law. And I was going to write my paper about the disparity in sentencing between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. What I learned in this course was that the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act implemented mandatory minimums and this 100-to-1 ratio, sentencing disparity ratio between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. And what that means is one of you could have 500 grams of powder cocaine. I could have only 5 grams of crack cocaine, and we're going to receive the same sentence in prison. Now, it's not lost on anyone today, and especially in the late 80s, that more affluent white people were using powder cocaine and crack cocaine was running rampant through communities of color, in particular Black communities. And so this law had a racially biased impact to the extent that nearly 70% of people in federal prison, even today, are Black and brown. While a law student in this course, learning about how these laws were implemented, learning about the devastation it was causing on communities of color, seeing the lengthy sentences that people were receiving for crack cocaine as it related to powder cocaine, I began to wonder if America's drug laws were tied to the quantity of drugs in a man's hand or the amount of melanin in his skin. What I found was heartbreaking, and I wanted to humanize my paper to show the heartbeats behind these devastating numbers. I did a Google search one late night in the SMU Underwood Law Library, and I came across the case of a woman, a case that would change my life forever. Her name was Sharonda Jones. She was a Black daughter of the rural South, like me, except I was a second-year law student, and Sharonda was serving her 10th year of a mandatory life without parole sentence for a federal drug offense. Her first ever conviction, felony or otherwise. Sharonda's case tugged at my soul. And even though I was in law school and on this track to practice corporate law, I sent Sharonda a card because I knew from when my own mother was in prison just the importance of receiving a piece of mail. And in this card, I told Sharonda that I was a law student and that I knew next to nothing about criminal law, but that I was going to get her out of prison. That began a journey of ups and downs, a journey of friendship, of family bonds that I still carry with me to this day. I went to visit Sharonda Jones, and I'll never forget our first visit. I was extremely nervous because I had never met anyone set to spend the rest of their lives in prison. You see, there is absolutely no parole in the federal system. So Sharonda Jones was set to die in prison. Sharonda Jones was serving the same amount of time as a Unabomber. And so I was nervous. I didn't know how her persona would be, if she would be angry or upset. But what I got was a woman whose smile lit up the visitation room, What I got was a woman whose positive attitude and vibes was clearly contagious to everyone she encountered. When I left the prison that day and I thought about just how Sharonda Jones could be so positive in the face of adversity that would be unbearable for many, I had a thought of what alternative is there to light and hope when your reality is so unbearable. And I took Sharonda's positive vibes and encouragement and let it empower me. Sharonda Jones and I went on a very long journey of me realizing that as lawyers, we are forced often in this criminal legal system to work within the bounds of laws that are outside the bounds of moral consciousness. It was mind blowing to me to learn that this country spends $80 billion a year on incarceration. And knowing that Sharonda Jones was set to die in prison, it was just both morally and economically unjustifiable. I learned that laws were changing and hearts and minds were changing in the criminal legal space. However, none of these laws were retroactive. I didn't understand because if the law was wrong today, surely it was wrong yesterday. I learned that the only avenue for relief for Sharonda Jones and many others would be clemency from President Barack Obama. After serving 16 years and 9 months, Sharonda Jones was freed. She was freed by the gracious and generous mercy of President Barack Obama. And I was freed, or so I thought. I thought now that this case had consumed almost 6 years of my life, that I would be continuing to climb the corporate ladder. By now, I had left the law firm. I was in-house counsel working in the mergers and acquisitions group, literally moving millions and billions of dollars by day and working pro bono by night to save lives. As I was starting to readjust and reimagine what my life would be like now that Sharonda was free, another case came calling. This of a man named Corey Jacobs. It was as if I was watching the same horror movie because his case was so similar to Sharonda's. Never been in trouble before, first offense, drug case, and he was serving his 16th year of a life without parole sentence. I went to visit Corey Jacobs in prison before I began to take his case. And his charisma, his genius was just undeniable. And I wondered what the world was missing out on, what Corey could have obtained in the success business wise if he weren't locked in a human cage for over a decade. Corey Jacobs became a mentor and a friend. He taught me how to meditate from prison. Here he is in a maximum security prison teaching me how to meditate. And it's one of the best practices that I've ever learned that was very helpful along the way. During my visit with Corey, he talked about how he had read that nature could enhance the meditation experience, but he had not seen a tree in years. A tree. I honestly cannot remember any of the conversation after that moment because I could not move past the fact that he had not seen a tree. I left the visit with Corey feeling empowered, wanting to use my platform as a lawyer for the greater good. The first thing I did, of course, while driving to the airport was I took in every single tree that I could, from the trunks to the branches to the leaves. The next thing I did was, after much reflection, when I got back to Dallas, was I resigned from corporate law. I resigned from corporate law to follow my passion to transform the system. I began to get heavily involved with Obama's clemency initiative, really working to, again, show the heartbeat, show the human element of this issue and how it is devastating lives, how the human ingenuity that this nation needs to thrive, much of it is locked up. During this time, I was blessed enough to have 7 clients who received clemency from President Barack Obama, 7 clients who were living life after life, 7 clients who are having a ripple effect and positively impacting the world. I then co-founded the Buried Alive Project with Sharonda Jones and Corey Jacobs, who received clemency by President Barack Obama as well. And through the Buried Alive Project, we work to represent people who were buried alive under this nation's outdated federal drug laws. We've worked to free dozens of people. During this time, I also came across the case of a man named Chris Young. Chris Young grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, under a suffocating level of poverty and trauma that no child in America should have to endure. What was so moving and intriguing to me about Chris Young as I took on his case was the sheer brilliance. Chris Young gave a speech at sentencing that touched on economics, philosophy, history, what he would do if he were ever released. All of this while knowing that at the end of his speech, the federal judge would have absolutely no choice but to sentence him to spend the rest of his natural life in prison. Only 22 years old when arrested, Chris Young epitomizes untapped genius. Chris Young epitomizes the brilliance that this country needs. I am proud to say that Chris Young was freed just last month, and his freedom and Sharonda's freedom and Corey's freedom, it's so heartwarming for me, but it is also a lesson that I've realized in that as I work to free my clients, they are freeing me too. Through this work and while writing this book, I wanted to ensure that I told the truth, about racial injustice that bleeds through this nation's criminal legal system. Most importantly, that I told the truth about the people, the moms, the daughters, the sons, the fathers, the people who are locked in America's cages. As I reflected over the book, I realized that this issue of freedom, this definition of freedom was evolving for me, and that we can't keep rescuing people from prison and restoring them to poverty. And so I began to hold this vision of creating sustainable liberation, which includes economic liberation. How do we ensure that people like Chris Young and Sharonda Jones, once they are free, that they are put in positions to thrive and not merely survive? I also wrote the book for one other reason, and that was for girls of color in the South, in hopes that they could, through my story, continue to dream their biggest dream and to know that they can do anything that they set their minds to. For me, as we work on this massive issue of mass incarceration, we have to remember to center the human element. We have to remember, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. so eloquently says, that whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. And we have to also remember that there is absolutely nothing more urgent than freedom. Thank you all for your time.